Morning Claire Hébert walked into a pawn shop on Saint Laurent with 3 military medals in a ziplock bag. She told herself it was just practical. She needed the money. The medals were sitting in a shoebox under her bed. It was practical. Boy, she had been telling herself a lot of things were practical lately. The shop was called Échange Plus, one of those places with guitars hanging crooked in the window and a handwritten sign that says "Cash Today." The man behind the counter, a heavy-set guy named Tremblay with bifocals and a kind face, looked up when the bell above the door rang. He'd seen people come in with rings, with laptops, with hunting rifles still in their cases. He thought he had learned to read people quickly. Well, he had not seen someone carry themselves the way Claire did that morning. Chin up, shoulders back, the way people stand when they are absolutely determined not to cry in public. She set the bag on the glass counter. Blay looked at the medals without touching them. A gold star on a red ribbon, a service medal with a maple leaf embossed on its reverse, and underneath those, wrapped in a strip of tissue paper like something fragile, a Star of Military Valour. Look at her. She was maybe 30, maybe younger. It was hard to tell with people who had been through something. She wore dark green scrubs under an unzipped parka. There was a hospital lanyard still around her neck. She hadn't even taken it off. "Well, these yours?" he asked. "Well, yes." "Well, you're sure you want to?" "Liz, I need to know what you can give me for them." Tremblay was still looking at the Star of Military Valour. He had been in the business for 19 years, and he had seen 2 of them come through his shop. Both times from the estates of old men who had died without children. Never from someone still wearing hospital scrubs. To answer when the dog moved. Claire hadn't noticed the dog. It had been lying behind the counter, flat on its side, the kind of boneless sprawl that big working dogs do when they're fully at rest. A Belgian Malinois, lean and dark-faced, with a vest marked RCMP K9. Its handler, a man in plainclothes with a constable's badge clipped to his belt, was standing near the back of the shop, looking at a rack of acoustic guitars. He'd come in 10 minutes earlier to ask Tremblay about a stolen amp they were tracking. Well, the dog's name was Rémi. Rémi had been asleep, and then he wasn't. He rose from behind the counter in one smooth motion, the way those dogs always move, like something hydraulic. He walked around the end of the counter, past Tremblay's stool, and stopped directly beside Claire. Not in front of her. Beside her. He pressed the full weight of his flank against her leg and looked up at the medals on the counter. Then he laid his chin on the glass. Claire looked down at him. She had not expected this. She hadn't expected any of this. The way her throat closed, the way her hand moved without her permission to rest on top of his broad head. He didn't pull away. He made a low sound, not a whine exactly, more like an exhale that had some intention behind it. Rémi, the handler, called from the back. He'd turned around. He was watching. Rémi did not move. Wolf, the handler. Sergeant Bolac, though he didn't introduce himself that way, just walked up and said his name was Gilles. Came to stand on the other side of Claire. He looked at the medals. He looked at her. He looked at his dog, who still had not moved his chin from the glass. "Rémi only does that for 2 kinds of people," Gilles said quietly. "Kids who are scared. And soldiers." Claire said nothing for a moment. Outside, Saint Laurent was doing what it always did on a gray November morning. Buses grinding past, someone's cartwheels on the sidewalk, the smell of pain au chocolat drifting from somewhere down the block. Normal. Everything outside was so completely normal. "I'm a nurse," she said finally. "Well, I can see that," Gilles said, nodding toward the lanyard, "but you're also something else." Or, she had been trying for 8 months not to be something else. She had been trying to just be a nurse. To go to work, to take her shifts, to be the person who showed up reliably in room 14 when the call light went on. But 8 months ago, the hospital had taken that away from her too. And now she was standing in a pawn shop in November with a dog's chin on a glass counter and a Star of Military Valour in a Ziploc bag, and she was so tired of being practical about things. Her name was Claire Hébert. She was 31 years old. She had served 2 tours as a combat nurse with the Canadian Armed Forces, one in Latvia as part of NATO's enhanced forward presence, one embedded with a forward surgical team in a theater she was not technically supposed to discuss in detail. She had been awarded the Star of Military Valour for keeping 4 soldiers alive during a 12-hour evacuation under conditions that a citation had described as extraordinary. She had come home, transitioned out of the forces with an honorable discharge, completed her RN certification in Quebec, and been hired by the Centre Hospitalier de l'Université de Montréal. Believed, genuinely, that she was starting over. 14 months into her position at the CHUM, a man named Directeur Rochon, the administrative director of her unit, had filed a disciplinary report against her. The report accused her of insubordination and patient endangerment. It cited an incident in which Claire had overridden an attending physician's order during a code situation, administering a drug protocol she had used in the field. The patient had lived. The drug protocol had been correct. Every nurse on that floor knew it. Rochon filed the report anyway. Claire had tried to fight it through the union. She'd tried to go above Rochon to the unit chief, Dr. Falardeau. What she hadn't known at the time, what she only pieced together later, from fragments, from a conversation overheard in a stairwell, from a pattern of things that made no sense, unless you looked at them in a particular way, was that Rochon and Falardeau had been quietly managing liability around a series of underdosing incidents that had occurred before Claire arrived, incidents that might become much more visible if the spotlight ever swung toward their unit. Claire, with her military background and her loud certainty about drug protocols, was a liability in a different way. She made people uncomfortable. She asked questions at staff meetings that the right people didn't want asked. It was easier to move her out. The union arbitration had gone badly. Her representative had been underprepared. The file had been presented as a workplace conduct issue, not a whistleblowing situation, and Claire hadn't understood the difference until it was too late. She'd been suspended pending review in March. By June, the review board had upheld the suspension and recommended termination. She had been a nurse for 14 months. She had kept 4 soldiers alive in the dark with what was left in a field kit and the force of her own refusal to let them go, and a review board had decided she was not fit to work a hospital floor. She had 3 months of savings. She'd been paying rent on her apartment in Rosemont, buying groceries on a budget that got smaller every week, telling her mother in Rivière-du-Loup that things were fine. She had not gone home for Thanksgiving. She told her mother she was picking up shifts. Well, the shifts did not exist. She'd been applying for positions at other hospitals, Sacré-Cœur, Saint-Luc, Jewish General, and every application had stalled at the reference check stage. She didn't know yet whether Rochon was actively making calls, or whether her name was simply attached to a file that made HR departments cautious. She just knew that the phone didn't ring. By November, the savings were gone. Her landlord had been patient for 1 month. He would not be patient for 2. She'd gone through the apartment looking at everything she owned, calculating. The medals were in the shoebox. She'd taken them out and put them on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. Practical, she told herself. This is practical. Gilles did not try to stop her from leaving that morning. That wasn't his place and he knew it. But he gave her his card, and he stood in the doorway of Échange Plus, with Rémi sitting precisely at his left heel, and he watched her walk south toward the metro station until she was gone. He called his sister that evening. His sister's name was Annette, and she ran a legal aid clinic in NDG that handled a mix of employment law and civil rights cases. He told her what he had seen, the scrubs, the lanyard, the Star of Military Valour in a ziplock bag, the way Rémi had moved to her without being asked. Rémi doesn't do that, he said. Well, you've told me what Rémi does, Annette said. Tell me about the woman. Well, he told her what he knew, which wasn't much. But Annette had been doing this long enough to hear the shape of a case even in fragments. If she was terminated for conduct related to patient care, and if there's reason to believe the report was retaliatory, Annette said slowly, that's not a union arbitration, that's a human rights complaint. Possibly a wrongful dismissal action. Possibly both. Or she needs someone to look at her file. Then she needs to call me, Annette said. Can you reach her? Would. He had not asked for her number, but Tremblay had carefully, while Claire was still standing at the counter. Tremblay had daughters. He had watched people come in with things they shouldn't have to sell. He had learned, over 19 years, to do the small thing that was available to him. Jill sent Claire a text that night. Short, no pressure. Just, I think I know someone who can help if you want. No obligation. Well, she didn't answer that night. She answered 3 days later, after the second letter from her landlord arrived. Olak did not promise her anything. That was the first thing Claire noticed. She didn't use the language of easy reassurance, the soft words that Claire had learned to distrust after the union arbitration. Annette sat across from her in the NDG office, which smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and she read through the file that Claire had brought in a manila envelope. She read slowly. She made notes in the margin of a yellow legal pad. She asked precise questions. Did you keep any records from the code event? Your own notes? Anything? Everything, Claire said. I'm military. You keep records of everything. And shifted in Annette's expression. Not quite a smile. Good. That's very good. The file was worse than Annette had hoped and better than she'd feared. The disciplinary report had procedural irregularities. A timeline discrepancy that put the formal report 2 weeks after an informal meeting between Rochon and Falardeau that should not have happened before a report was filed. There was also the question of the underdosing incidents, which Annette pulled from public hospital inspection records with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this before. 3 incidents, logged and closed before Claire's arrival. Logged and closed in a way that, when you looked at the dates and the names on the reports, suggested certain people had been very careful about what went on record and what didn't. "I'm going to tell you," Annette said, setting down her pen, "is that I can't guarantee how this ends. What I can tell you is that there is enough here to file." File what, exactly? Formal complaint with the Commission des droits de la personne. Retaliatory termination. We tie it to the procedural violations, and we use the inspection records to establish context. We also contact the Collège des Médecins separately about Falardeau. That's a parallel track, not part of your case directly, but it matters. Claire was quiet for a moment. Outside the office window, a school across the street was emptying for lunch. Kids in bright coats on a gray November sidewalk. "How long does this take?" she asked. "Lee? The complaint process alone can take a year, maybe more. I can't pay rent for a year." Annette nodded. She had expected this. "There's an emergency housing support through a veterans services organization I work with. You wouldn't be the first person from the forces I've connected them with. It's not a lot, but it covers a room and groceries while a case is in process. I can make a call today if you want." Claire looked at her hands on the table. She was wearing the lanyard again. She couldn't seem to stop wearing it, even now, even though it led nowhere. The hospital ID with her photo, her name, her credentials. Registered nurse. Chum. She had worn it into the pawn shop and she hadn't taken it off since. "Okay," she said. "File." Ace moved the way these things move. Not quickly, not cleanly, with long stretches of waiting broken by sudden urgent requests for documents and then more waiting. Annette kept her informed at every step. The commission acknowledged receipt of the complaint in January. Rochon's lawyers filed a response in February. Annette read it, wrote 4 pages of notes, and called Claire to say the response had confirmed 2 things she had suspected and revealed a third she hadn't. Falardeau wrote a supporting statement for Rochon, Annette said. But the statement has a date problem. He says he reviewed the incident report on April 9th. The incident report wasn't filed until April 11th. Full silence on Claire's end. He signed off on a document before it existed, Claire said. Old, yes. Claire had been staying in a room in a house in Verdun, owned by an organization called Les Anciens de Corps, a veterans support group that ran 3 houses in Montreal for people in transition. The room was small and the walls were thin, and she could hear the man next door watching hockey every night. She had taken a part-time job at a pharmacy on Wellington, not as a nurse, just stocking shelves and working the cash, and she had not told her mother about any of this because there was nothing to say yet, nothing that resolved into a sentence she could speak without her voice breaking. But she had her file. She had Annette. She had, inexplicably, Gilles, who texted her occasionally with updates that had nothing to do with the case, just things like Remy ate a glove today, very proud of himself. and she had the slow, grinding, unglamorous process of being believed by a bureaucracy that moved like cold syrup. Break came in April. There was a retired colonel named Gauthier. Colonel Adrien Gauthier, who had served in Logistics Command for 22 years and was now, in her retirement, extremely interested in what happened to the people who came home from service and tried to rebuild civilian lives. She had been following a quiet conversation in veteran services circles about retaliatory terminations of former military personnel in healthcare settings. She had seen Claire's name in a report summary that Annette had submitted to a veteran advocacy board. Boy called Annette directly. She said she had information about a pattern, not just Claire's case, but 3 other nurses, 2 of them former reserves, who had been terminated from Quebec hospitals in the past 4 years under circumstances that shared structural similarities. Retaliatory reporting, procedural irregularities, and in each case, a prior conduct issue in the unit that someone had reason to keep quiet. She's willing to submit a formal statement, Annette told Claire. A colonel's statement to the commission. It changes the weight of the complaint significantly. It places your case inside a larger documented pattern. Claire was at the pharmacy when Annette called. She was standing in the back near the stockroom door with her phone pressed to her ear and the smell of cardboard and antiseptic around her. She was wearing the same dark green scrubs she wore at the hospital because they were the most comfortable thing she owned and because she had stopped caring, somewhere around February, about the small awkwardness of wearing nurses' scrubs to a pharmacy job when she was no longer technically a nurse. Breathed. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed. "Wait," she said. "What do we do next?" The commission ruling came in July, 14 months after Rochon had filed the original disciplinary report. It found in Claire's favor on 2 of 3 grounds. Retaliatory conduct was established, and procedural violations were substantiated. Third ground, direct evidence of coordination between Rochon and Falardeau, was not established to the Commission's standard, though the ruling noted the date discrepancy in Falardeau's statement, and referred the matter separately to the Collège des Médecins. Rochon's employer, the hospital board, was required to issue a formal notice of wrongful termination. Claire was awarded back pay for 14 months, damages, and an official letter of rehabilitation to her professional record with the Ordre des Infirmières et Infirmières du Québec. It was not everything. There were no cameras, no press conference, no moment where Rochon stood in a hallway and understood the weight of what he had done. He was quietly moved to a different administrative role. Falardeau's case at the collège was still open. The 3 other nurses, the ones Gauthier had named, were in various stages of their own processes, which would take years. The letter was real. The back pay was real. Her record was clean. Annette called her at 8 in the morning on the day the ruling arrived. Claire was sitting on the edge of her bed in the Verdun room, still in the clothes she'd slept in, because she hadn't been sleeping much in the final weeks of waiting. She listened to Annette read the relevant paragraph twice. Then she sat there for a while with the phone in her hand. Lauder, she called her mother. Old. She had not been home to Rivière-du-Loup in 16 months. Her mother, whose name was Sylvie, and who made the best tourtière in 3 counties, and who had not asked a single pointed question in 16 months, because she understood intuitively that her daughter was being held together by a very specific kind of tension that questions might disturb. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Woman," Claire said, "I'm coming home." Pause. Not confusion. Just her mother understanding that something had shifted and giving it the right amount of space. "Put something on," Sylvie said. Well, she went to see Tremblay before she left the city. Walked into Échange Plus on a Wednesday afternoon in August, and the bell rang above the door the same way it always had, and Tremblay looked up over his bifocals. He recognized her immediately. She could see it, the small adjustment in his posture, the way his face went careful and then warm. She had an envelope. Inside the envelope was a check. Not a large one, not nearly what they were worth, but what Tremblay had offered her that November morning before Rémy had stood up and changed the direction of everything. I never actually sold them," she said, pushing the envelope across the counter. Or Tremblay said, "You didn't." Wanted to leave this anyway, for your time. Looked at the envelope. He pushed it back. Put it towards something better, he said simply. Moment. The shop smelled the same. Old wood, machine oil, the faint brass and dust smell of instruments. A guitar was playing somewhere through a small radio behind the counter. Something with a lot of pedal steel in it, something unhurried. Will was not there that day. But she'd already said goodbye to him in a parking lot near the Verdun house, with Rémi sitting precisely at his heel and looking at her with the same focused, quiet attention he had given her in November. She had crouched down and held his face in both hands, and he had let her, patient and still, and she had said something to him in a low voice that she would not have said out loud to a person. She drove up to Rivière-du-Loup on a Thursday. The St. Lawrence was enormous and gray, and completely indifferent to everything she had been through, which she found, as she always had, deeply comforting. Her mother met her at the door and hugged her, without saying anything about how thin she was or how tired she looked, just held on for a moment longer than a regular hug. Portière was on the stove. The kitchen smelled like her childhood. She sat down at the table, and her mother put a plate in front of her and sat across from her and poured tea for both of them. "Are you all right?" Sylvie asked. Claire picked up her fork. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was August green and loud with insects. Her old life, the life before the forces, before Rochon and his report and 14 months of trying to stay upright. Her old life was all over this kitchen, in the chips on the cabinet doors and the particular angle of afternoon light. "Will be," she said. She meant it. That was the thing about Claire Hébert. She did not say things she didn't mean. She had learned that in the field, in the dark, with a kit and a timer and 4 people counting on her not to be wrong about what she was capable of. You didn't say it's going to be okay unless you were certain you could make it so. You said I'm here and you meant it, and you did the work. It was here. She had done the work. She would go back to nursing. Annette had already been in contact with Sacré-Cœur, and there was a position, and they had seen her file and her record and the commission ruling, and they had not hesitated. She would start in September. August. First her mother's kitchen and the tourtière and the big gray river outside and the particular luxury of not having anywhere to be. She ate. The food was warm and good and real. Outside, the August light moved slow and golden through the yard, the way it does in Quebec in summer, when the evening comes late and stays gentle. And the river keeps moving the way it always has, enormous and unhurried and carrying everything forward. I keep thinking about the ziplock bag. That's the detail that stays with me. Not the medals themselves, but the fact that she put them in a ziplock bag, like groceries, like something you'd grab out of a drawer without thinking too hard about it, because if you thought too hard, you might not go through with it. Claire didn't lose her way because she made a wrong choice. She lost her footing because she made a right one. She did exactly what a good nurse is supposed to do, exactly what her training told her to do, and the people around her decided that made her inconvenient. That's a particular kind of injustice. It doesn't announce itself. Where's the language of procedure and review boards and professional conduct, and it grinds you down slowly enough that you start to wonder if maybe they were right about you after all. What I think about, when I sit with this story, is what it actually takes to stay upright through something like that. It's not one big dramatic act. It's the smaller things, keeping every record the way Claire did, because her military training had made documentation second nature. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't get talked about enough. The practical, unglamorous intelligence of knowing that the truth needs evidence, and that evidence doesn't preserve itself. She didn't know in March that she'd need those notes in November. She kept them anyway. That habit, that discipline of mind, is what gave Annette something to work with. You can't build a case out of feelings. You need dates and signatures and discrepancies on a timeline. And then there's what Tremblay did, what Gilles did, not what Colonel Gauthier did, a retired officer who had no obligation to anyone in that story, who simply saw a pattern and decided it was worth her name on a statement. None of these people were required to act. The Ziploc bag would have gone across that counter, and Claire would have walked out with whatever Tremblay offered her, and nobody in that system would have noticed or cared. People who intervened did it because they looked at a situation and asked themselves what the right thing was and then did it, even when doing nothing was easier and completely defensible. Well, I think that's what I mean when I say character matters. Not character as a performance, not the grand gesture or the public stand, but the private, daily decision to be the kind of person who notices, who keeps records, who sends a text into the dark on the off chance it reaches someone who needs it. Claire got her record back. She got her back pay. She got September at Sacré-Cœur and August in her mother's kitchen, and the big gray river outside the window. None of that happened automatically. It happened because she held on long enough, stayed sharp enough, and because a few people around her decided that what was happening to her was wrong and they had something to offer. What I take from her story is this: the people who come through the worst of it are rarely the ones who never got knocked down. They're the ones who kept their integrity intact on the way down and had enough clarity left to recognize help when it showed up. Even when it showed up as a dog putting its chin on a glass counter in a pawn shop on Saint Laurent. Well, some things you just can't explain. But you don't have to explain them to be grateful for them.